when Cinda said that she watched the sermon 3 times, I would think to myself, that's where those 3 views came from. I was very proud. No, it's not working. Is this thing on? Anyway, a little self-deprecation to start the morning. We're finishing up this week our sermons on series on faith, the topic, and it's coming to this climax about one of the more famous characters in the Bible, Moses, and what his faith was and what it looks like. But before I get to that, let me take a step back, because most of you probably weren't here when we started looking through the book of the chapter, Hebrews chapter 11. But the writer in Hebrews is writing to a group of people who are on the edge of giving up. They're faced with opportunity. They're faced with a decision, and they're at a crossroads. They're highly persecuted. They're oppressed. They're marginalized. And they're looking at it, and they would be scratching their head saying, listen, I could go on with this whole Christian thing, but I know where it's going to take me, probably into utter destruction and utter ruin. My family probably will abandon me. I'll most likely lose my job. I could lose my life. I could go to prison. They're losing all hope, these people. And the writer of Hebrews is writing to them about faith, but ultimately faith, really, if you're going to sum it up in a word, is endurance. It's the ability to endure. See, in Hebrews chapter 12, when the writer of Hebrews says, he gives all these models in the Old Testament of faith, but he says they all point to one person, and that's Jesus. Why? Because for the sake of the cross, he endured, it says. And that Greek word endured is a word called hypomenos or hupomenos. And it's where we get menos, meaning to stand, meaning to put your feet down in the ground. And hubo, where we get our word for hyper, meaning basically the writer's saying faith, endurance, is hyper standing. It's the ability to hyper stay. And that sounds like a Star Trek word now that I just said that. But it's the ability to hyper stand, to put your feet down so far into the ground, rooted down, that nobody can move you. It's a hyper stance, and that's endurance. And the writer of Hebrews says, listen, if you want to live the Christian faith, you're going to have to know what endurance is, what it looks like, and how you get the power to do it. And today we look at Moses. And Moses, this is actually a very difficult message to prepare, because the writer of Hebrews, in a few short verses, captures what is actually in about a few books about Moses' life in the Bible. He takes it and he squeezes it all together, and he says, listen, this is Moses in a nutshell. This is what you need to know about Moses. It's distilled down. And what's interesting about what he says about Moses is that he points out that Moses had opportunities and decisions to make in his life. He constantly came to a crossroads. And constantly, Moses shows us, when we are at the crossroads of our life, when we're at a major life decision, a major crisis point, which some of you are at this point in your life, you can either choose to go this way or that way. And he's saying, look, if you look at these examples of what Moses chose, he always stuck to his principles. He chose God, even when, and most often when it looks like the way that that's going to go is utter ruin, career disaster, and reputation suicide. See, Moses, is just like you and me, he's presented with opportunities, decisions, crossroads. Go this way or go that way. Follow God's way or follow another way. And we're going to look at that today, but what do you have to see? And this is, I'm going to state an obvious thing, and most of you know this because you're at a crossroads right now in your life. You're at a point where you have to make a major life decision, and it's hard to know which way to go. And it's even harder to say, well, I know if I go God's way, the way I know God's telling me, I know what that's going to end up looking like, and I don't like it. So I might just veer a little bit this way. And opportunities are precious. Opportunities, they just come, I almost sound like the Eminem song. They come once in a lifetime, right? Opportunities. Now you guys are chuckling. That song's going to be in your head all day because it was in my head this morning when I was thinking about this. Opportunities are rare. They do just come once in a lifetime. Eminem was right, but here's another guy who said it this way, a much more beautiful way than Eminem would say it. J.J. Ingalls was a politician And hopefully I included this quote in your outline. He was deciding whether to go into politics or another career profession, and he was right on the precipice, and he didn't know what to do, and he was wavering, and he said it was a crisis point in his life, and he looks at it and he says, this is opportunity, and he defines it in a very poetic way, to show you and me the weight of opportunities, the weight of our decisions, the weight of if we decide to go this way or that way, and what it means. And he says this about opportunity. Master of human destinies am I. Fame, love, and fortune on my footsteps wait. City and fields I walk, I penetrate deserts and seas remote, and passing by hovel and mart and palace, soon or late, I knock unbidden once at every gate. He says, if sleeping wake, if fasting rise before I turn away, it is the hour of fate, and they who follow me reach every state. Mortals, desire and conquer every foe save death. But those who doubt or hesitate me, condemned to failure, penury and woe, seek me in vain and needlessly implore. I answer not, I return no more. See, what he's saying is, you have an opportunity right now. You may be at the point of making a major life decision. Don't take it lightly. He says, this is heavy stuff. The way you choose now, if you go God's way or if you go the other way, it's going to determine the trajectory of the rest of your life. You need to know what endurance looks like in the midst of a crisis. He was in the midst of a crisis. He says, the weight of opportunity is almost going to crush me. And this story that we just read, or that we read in Hebrews, is all about decisions. Throughout this, Moses makes decision after decision after decision, and it shows you and me what it means to be a durable person, what it means to be a hyper-standing person, what it means that in the face of crisis, in the face of a major life decision, we will stand firm, planted in our principles, rooted down, and nothing can shake us. This morning, do you want to be a durable person? Moses shows us how. He gives us actually 4 demonstrations of endurance, and he gives us 3 reasons. And I know what you're thinking. No, it's not going to be a 7-point sermon, so don't worry. I stick to my 3 usually. I'm diverging a little bit, and this is why. It's because what I want to do is look at the narrative of Moses' life. I want to look at the story. And as the story unravels, as the story unfolds, the writer of Hebrews says, look, as every turn, at every moment of his life, he makes these life-changing, crucial decisions. And oftentimes it looks like utter destruction and utter ruin, but he stays with it. He plants firm because he knows something. He knows something that if you and I tap into as a power, will change the way you and I make decisions in the face of crisis, in the face of major life opportunities. Let's delve into this. First, he shows us 4 things that Moses does. He says he refused to be called a child of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, why is that important? Why would he say he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter? Okay, let's go back to the narrative. And we're going to be flipping between the book of Exodus and Hebrews, so you might get a little whiplash. Bear with me. You can keep both open if you have 2 smartphones, which some of you do. Book of Exodus. Moses is born. The Pharaoh says, there's too many Hebrews. We have to start killing them. Moses' parents hide him because they know he's special. They say that he has beauty. They know there's something special about this guy. So they hide him. Then eventually, remember, they put him in the basket and they ship him down the river. And Miriam, his sister, follows along the riverside to keep track of this baby Moses in the carriage. And the baby carriage, the wicker basket or whatever it was, comes up next to the Pharaoh's daughter, and she's bathing in the river. And she says, okay, she sees the baby is obviously Hebrew. She knew it was a Hebrew baby, and she says, I'll take him. But I can't breastfeed him. I can't nurse him. So she looks at Miriam, not knowing who she is, and says, hey, can you find somebody who can go and nurse this child for me? And Miriam, of course, knows. I'll go get his real mother. So she takes Moses back to Moses' real mother, and this is the part that most people miss in that story. It says that when the child grew, the mother presented Moses back to the Pharaoh as her son. And that word used for son would heavily imply that Moses was raised to at least about the age of 12 or 13 by his own mother. In the ways of the Hebrew culture, he was raised as a Hebrew, as a young boy. He would have known of the promise of Abraham. He would have known of a messianic promise to come. He would have known of God's deliverance. He would have been known and steeped in his own Hebrew heritage and culture. Then he's presented as a son to the Pharaoh's daughter. For the next, and then actually in Hebrew, in Exodus, they're very short. It says he grew. That was a period of 40 years, but they kind of just say he grew. 40 years he grew in the Egyptian culture, in the Egyptian language, in the Egyptian system. He grew in it. He knew it. He got indoctrinated by it. So here he comes, fully Hebrew, fully a future prince. But then the Pharaoh says, you know what? These Hebrews are just getting too out of control in terms of number. And he takes the Hebrews and he puts them into forced labor. Now Moses is at a tipping point. Because Moses knows he cannot be the prince of Egypt as a Hebrew. There's two conflicting identities. He gets it now. He sees his people, his mother, his uncles, his cousins. He sees them being put in a forced labor, and he's at a crisis point. What do I choose? Do I choose the prestige of the palace? Or do I choose the poverty of the poor? He knows that he can't be both. This Pharaoh is not like the Pharaoh in Joseph's life who liked the Israelites and the Hebrews. This Pharaoh does not. And he's in the crosshairs and he knows it. And what he does one day, he goes out and he makes a choice. And it's not the total right choice, but it is a choice. Do you remember he walks out and he sees the Egyptian taskmaster beating the Hebrew slave, and he intervenes and he kills the Egyptian and he buries him. At that point, bye-bye palace. He has cast his lot with this Hebrew people, his people. He's coming from the world of prestige, the palace, the comforts, the security, and he's made a decision. He stays true because look, what he's saying is, I see these people. I know that it's not right what's happening here. I see the social injustice of forced labor and enslavement. I see it and I can't stand by. I have to do something about it. Now he doesn't do exactly the right thing because murder is never condoned. But what he does is he makes a crucial life decision at this point to say, I will endure. This looks like complete suicide to get rid of the palace. I'm out of it now. Because you remember the next day when he comes and the two Israelites are fighting with each other and he tries to intervene, they say, what, are you going to kill me like you killed him the other day? And Moses knows, my secret's out. It's only a number of days before the Pharaoh finds out. See, his first show of endurance is that he says, listen, I will cast my lot with them. But what's interesting is also in Hebrews, it says here, next, he also left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Why did he leave Egypt? Because first he chose to cast his lot with the Hebrews. Then he went out the next day and he saw the two Hebrew men fighting. And he decides to intervene again. And one Hebrew slave says something very interesting to him. He says, who do you think you are? Do you think you're going to be judge of us? You see what he's doing now? He's at a major choice again because he's going to be rejected by the palace. Now he's getting rejected by the very people who he wanted to save in the first place, and he has to leave. Now, this looks what we would call in modern day terms, in corporate America, we would call it career suicide. We would say, Moses, you have all of these leadership gifts. Yeah, you don't speak the best. You're not the most articulate guy, but you're going to be a future prince one day. Why would you go do that to the Egyptian? Why put your career at risk to save another person? And then the next day he comes out to help those same people and they reject him. And you would look at Moses and say, why do you want to help them if they're just going to reject you? It's career suicide. It's a waste of your talents. It's a waste of your resources. Don't do it. But Moses endures. He endures again by going back to Pharaoh. If you look at your passage, this is the third way he endures. It says that by faith he kept the Passover. Now what this means is that Moses had enough endurance that when God came to him when he was an 80-year-old man, a washed-up has-been, a never was, out in the wilderness. And God said, I want you to go back to the strongest man in the world and I want you to tell him you're going to take his entire free labor force away. Moses did it. And not only did he endure enough to go back to Pharaoh, but he kept the Passover, the most major fundamental religious rite of a marginalized people. He should be on the run. If Moses were like you and me, he would have found a nice hole to crawl into, set up shop, and lived out his days in comfort and security. But at 80 years old, God comes to him in the burning bush and he says, I want you to go. And Moses goes. He goes back to the strongest person in the world, with the strongest army, with a message that would surely kill him. Do you see now? 3 life decisions. Utterly absurd. And yet Moses is putting his feet down. He's hyper standing. And the last example of this enduring faith is when it says in Hebrews, by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea. Now, do you remember this story? What most people don't remember is that God actually said, Moses, I want you to take the people and go between this one big mountain and the big Red Sea. And it would have looked utterly absurd. This isn't career suicide. This is actual suicide. The greatest army in the entire world is after him. And God says, even then, you can stand in front of the sea. Put your foot down. And if you endure, that sea will open up. And it's interesting in Exodus, in verse 13, with that story in chapter 14, the people are all worried, just like you and I would be. And at every point of decision-making in Moses' life, he's shown endurance. He's hyper-stood. He said, I will stand by God's principles, not my own. I'll stand by God's principles, not the world. And now the people are panicking. Wouldn't you panic if you were looking at the sea with the army at your back and the mountain at your side? And he says, people, Moses answered them saying, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you'll never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Take this in. In the moment of ultimate panic, in the moment in which he's gone this way or this way his entire life, but now it's either death by the sea or death by the army. And he looks at these people and he says, only be still. See, an enduring faith says for you and me in the moments of our life's greatest decisions and crises and opportunities, we need only be still. Stand firm. Now, how does he do it? There's 3 ways that I'm going to touch on rather quickly. There's 3 verbs that the writer of Hebrews uses, which we really need. I wish we had more time to unpack it. This actually could be a whole other message, but I'm going to summarize it this way. First verb, it says he regarded, or some of your translations may consider, he says he regarded the disgrace of Christ greater than the treasures of Egypt, right? That word regarded is wrongly translated. This is a mathematical term. He says he counted. It says Moses looked and he counted something. And this is, when people say faith is taking a blind leap. No, it's not. It's not at all. It's a leap, but it's not blind. If anybody ever tells you take a blind leap of anything, don't do it. It's stupid. It really is dumb to don't do it now. Close your eyes and jump. No, don't do that. Faith is a leap, but it's not a blind leap. Look what Moses is doing here. He's calculating. He's regarding. He's considering. Let me illustrate it this way. Most of you know that I have a dear and beloved fish tank in my house. You know this. Most of you have seen this fish tank, said fish tank. I love this fish tank, and I hope you all can see it one day. I put a lot of time and effort into it. The thing about this fish tank is I can tell you the exact value of every single thing in there, even the sand. I can tell you how much it is. I can tell you the value. I've calculated it. Why? Because I've regarded it. I've looked into it. I've studied it. If you want a faith that's an enduring faith, you're going to have to look into God and regard the treasures that you have. You're going to have to calculate it. To contrast that, I have this fish tank. In a cabinet down on the ground, I have a set of plates that my mother gave me. Very old, and they're from her wedding, her china collection. Now, they may very well be valuable. I have no clue because I've never regarded them. I've never taken one plate out and looked at it in wonder and in awe, and another plate and said, how much is this worth? And another cup, how much is this worth? You see, our relationship with God, if you want to know where your treasure is, you're going to have to calculate. You're going to have to go to God and say, let me regard and consider the wealth that you have for me. Moses does it. And he says, I'd rather feel the disgrace of Christ because that's worth infinitely more than the worth of Egypt. How do you do this in your life? You're going to have to calculate your treasure in God's eyes versus your treasure here, whatever you value the most. And Moses says, I put my value in that, and that makes me unshakable, because that's unshakable. That's untouchable. Next, he says that he chose to be mistreated along with his people. And this is very important. I wish I could spend more time unpacking this. What it means by that in Hebrews when it says he chose to be, that he would be mistreated. It means that he said, I will put my lot in with these Hebrew people, even though, and most often because they will never listen to me, they will constantly disobey me, and I'll be mistreated for it. If you and me were with those Hebrew people who would never listen to him, we'd surely look at them and say, why am I wasting my time on you? Why am I wasting my gifts and my talents and my resources on you guys, you ungrateful little idiots? Moses says, no. I will choose to follow God's will in leading these people, even when, and most often when, it means I'm going to be mistreated, when they're not going to listen to me, when they're not going to respect me. He regards his wealth. He chooses the path of God, even though it looks stupid, absurd, and that he's going to lose almost everything. But the last part, and the most beautiful, if you look back in Hebrews 11, it says, he saw him who is invisible. He saw him who is invisible. This is a Hebrew idiom for being able to say, he saw what he couldn't see. And I know that sounds self-explanatory. He saw the invisible. He said this. In his mind, as he's calculating with God, he's saying, look, I'm at a major decision point in my life. I can go God's way, which looks stupid and absurd and may mean loss for me. Or I can go this way, which means prestige in the palace and honor and respect from my peers. And he says, I will go this way. Why? Because he sees something invisible. He knows God's wisdom. When it says he sees him who is invisible, he's basically saying this. Moses, God is much smarter than you are. So accept his wisdom over yours. Now what's beautiful about this is that Moses accepts the wisdom of God even though it's invisible. You and I, as Paul writes thousands of years later, have the wisdom of God made visible. Because Moses left the palace, but there was one who came later who would leave a much greater palace. Moses went to his own people and they knew him not. They rejected him. And there's one greater than Moses who would come years later to his own people and they knew him not. We know Moses was rejected by his people and scorned. We know someone visible, the very wisdom of God who came to his own people and wasn't just scorned, he was killed. You want an enduring faith? Do you want to be a durable person? Moses was durable. He was enduring. Why? Because he saw something outside of himself that would come, something invisible, the wisdom made clear. You and I, because we're on this side of the cross, we see that wisdom. We see what Moses could only see as invisible, made visible. See, Moses had an enduring faith because he trusted in this invisible promise of God. I'm here this morning to tell you the invisible promise of God was made visible, and it hung on a cross for you. If, in the midst of your life decisions, in the midst of your crisis, in the midst of your opportunities, when you don't know to go this way or this way, in this way, God's way, looks like utter destruction and ruin, it looks like you're going to lose, look to that cross. See him who endured all. Moses had an enduring faith. Jesus was enduring faith. Poured out. He says, listen, what do you fear? If Moses could put his foot down at the Red Sea when he saw the invisible, You and I should be able to put our foot down at the Pacific Ocean because we see the visible, bleeding for us, enduring for us. If you see him enduring for you, you can endure anything. Go in silent prayer now to him.